Tell me your name and what your work is, what your work entitles.
My name is Marko Kaltofen. I'm a civil engineer. I'm with Worcester Polytechnic Institute, where I do research on airborne radiation spread.
Can you give some more detail on what encompasses airborne radiation spread?
I think a lot of people are hearing a lot about radiation from the Fukushima plants in Japan, and it's really hard for folks to understand. And what my research area is about is trying to pick apart exactly how that radiation spreads, how it spreads at the plant site, how it moves through the region, and how eventually it starts to travel intercontinentally. So examining what it is in the environment that's carrying this radiation so that people very far away can be exposed to it. And the other part of that is when we do find radiation in the environment, trying to track back to where it came from and what the source is, and maybe there's something that could get done about it.
So how do you go about tracking specifically where a source of radiation or a toxin comes from?
Well, one of the biggest things about the radiation from Fukushima or any kind of nuclear accident like that is that most of the radiation is bound to particles, little specks of dust. And if you know how big those particles are and what they're made out of, you can predict how far they're going to travel, how many you're going to breathe in, and what kind of risk people face depending on where they live because of an accident like that.
Okay. So how do you go about tracking specific particles?
Well, one of the first things that we did when the accident began back on March 11th was to start taking air filter samples. And some of what we do looks a lot like a home air filter that a lot of people might have that removes dust from the air. We just blow air through a filter. We know how long we're doing that. We know how much air goes through the filter. And we just capture all the dust particles that are left. You can actually just weigh them and find out how many you have. And then we examine those particles that we capture one by one and look to see what kind of radioactivity they carry and how much radioactivity. It gives us an idea of how much radioactivity people are actually breathing in, because we all have a filter that we carry around. It's called our lungs. It takes particles out of the air. So what we're doing is mimicking what happens in the human body. And then we just use the instruments at the university and we examine any radiation coming off those particles.
All right, so sticking with the example of your work in Fukushima, so you're taking air samples directly from there, from that region?
We're doing several different things at the same time from Japan. We have a large crew of people who have volunteered and collected samples. Many of them have technical training. They're part of an organization called SafeCast. It's essentially crowdsourcing environmental sampling, where we have people who are living in the area, who have technical knowledge, who are using the same type of radiation detection and sample collection equipment that you might use in any kind of university here in the United States. The samples are collected, they get sent overseas, and we look for those specific radioisotopes, things like cesium or uranium, that are in those different particles, and try and measure exactly how much might be in the air, how much is in the soil, how much is in the dust, and get a feel for what's happening as you get further and further away from the Fukushima plant.
Okay, so you're measuring the overall percentage of radioactive particles?
One thing that I have to admit that's kind of gotten my goat about the whole way we have reported on what's happening in Japan is we hear all these different analogies. We're trying to describe radiation as, well, this is the same as background radiation, or this is the same as taking an airplane from New York to San Francisco, or eating a banana. Bananas have a naturally radioactive element in there in tiny proportions. None of that really makes sense. What we're really worried about is there a dust particle that is small enough that you can inhale it, get it in your lungs? It's radioactive. It's going to sit there and potentially cause a tumor in your lung cells. The same way smoking cigarettes could cause a tumor in your lung cells. That's what we're worried about. We want to see if that radiation is spreading in a way that might actually harm folks. The way we do that is we look at what's actually in people's dust, whether it's from their home or dust that might settle on, say, on a sidewalk, or from an air filter. Or probably the biggest set of air filters we have are the air filters from automobiles. They're sucking in tremendous amounts of air, they're driving all over, they're exposed to a lot of dust. So after a couple of months of use, we have folks in Japan sending us the air filters from their cars We spread them all out, and you actually can lay those air filters on top of a piece of film. And unfortunately, because radiation exposes film, whenever we do that with a filter from certain parts of Japan, the film turns black. There's enough radiation in the filters from cars or even from a home. It will blacken X-ray film. And to a lesser extent, that will happen in cities even very far away, like Tokyo, over 100 miles from the accident site. And frankly, if you look at some samples that were collected in the United States, you'll even find 1 or 2 particles on your filter that will blacken film. And that means that there must be more of them out there that we're not capturing.
So how do you know that the particles that you are collecting, let's say in Japan, are specifically from the Fukushima disaster as compared to, let's say, some residual particles from either above ground testing or the Hiroshima and Nagasaki bombs?
There are other sources of radiation in our planet. There were other atomic bomb tests. There have been other accidents like Chernobyl, and they've all left particles that can float around, and you could test them and maybe mistake them for something from Fukushima. But Fukushima has something very unique because it's so recent. There are certain isotopes that don't last very long. They only last for months or a few years. And these isotopes from things like Chernobyl 25 years ago, or nuclear testing almost 50 years ago when nuclear testing peaked, those isotopes have decayed away. You don't find them anymore. So if you find some of these shorter-lived isotopes, like, well, in the beginning we found radioactive iodine, and we still find cesium-134. It's an isotope that lasts, about half of it decays every couple of years. So if we still find a lot of cesium-134, that means that we are still seeing something that was recent. So there haven't been any other nuclear explosions other than Fukushima in the past few years. That's a tag. That's a fingerprint. You find the cesium-134, it means that you're probably looking at something from Fukushima and not something from Chernobyl.
And is cesium-134 then what you use as the signature, or is it a combination of that and other elements that you can use as a signature, again, specifically to Fukushima?
Well, probably the biggest thing that we recognize is cesium-134. You'll find another form of cesium called 137 that tends to last a few decades, about 30 years before it decays by half. So when you see those two together, that's telling you that we're much more likely to be seeing something from Fukushima. And in the early weeks of the spill, when we saw iodine-131 that has a half-life of about 8 days, that was pretty definite. We got plenty of samples back in March and April that had a lot of iodine-131. If I pull out the same sample now from the storeroom, that iodine-131 is gone. That's all decayed away. But we'll still find that 134, and a few others too. Things like ruthenium-103 that have a half-life that's a little over a month. So that's something that will last a little bit longer.
Arnie Gunderson with Fairwinds Associates, is that?
Yep.
Reported a couple months back, I believe, about hot particles showing up on the west coast of the United States. Have you run across any evidence of similar to that?
We certainly do see hot particles on the west coast. It's not like being in Japan. You know, if you're in Tokyo, you're getting a pretty significant dose, even though it's outside the evacuation zone. But the winds generally blow from west to east, and we're east of Fukushima. So without any doubt, you would find those particles. And if you take a big enough air sample, you'll find them. Back in April, we probably found a lot more. We were really beginning to detect that first real pulse of hot particles that came from Fukushima and blew towards the east. So they were fairly easy to detect. EPA detected them from not just on the west coast, but from Hawaii all the way through the US and to the east coast as well. We saw the pulse from Fukushima in Boston. So there isn't too much doubt of that. We also have occasionally seen what's called a rainout. A rainout is when you might have radioactive particles passing by in the atmosphere, and a rainstorm will wash them out over a specific place. So if you go to a certain spot, and we've seen this happen in Oregon, we've seen this happen in Washington, you might find a small locality that got a lot more radiation than everyone else. And it's just chance. It's just bad luck. I think the existence of hot particles in Seattle and the West Coast it was predictable, it's well documented, And it's probably going to be impossible to find all the places where those hot particles ended up. There are just too many isolated spots.
Do you believe the hot particles that went beyond Japan are a threat to the population where they are being found?
Well, a hot particle in Japan or a hot particle in the United States, it's going to do the same amount of damage if it has the same amount of radiation. The only thing that's different is the odds. If you're in Japan, you're much more likely to be exposed to it. In the US, it's probably more of a rare event. You're a lot less likely. But it may be that we'll never really know in the US which people suffered health damage that was related to Fukushima. We don't really have a way of tracking where an individual person's cancer came from if it's because of a random event like that. If someone was in Fukushima at the time, you might say, all right, well, you got a cancer, you were in Fukushima, we know where it came from. Or if you have radioactive dust in your home, you can go and test it, you can see and say, well, this was probably the cause. But, we got the hot particles here. They were at relatively high concentration compared to normal for a matter of weeks or maybe as long as a month, depending on where you were. And we just don't know. We know we increased the risk, but we can't point to anybody and say, you better get checked.
Are there places that citizens who are concerned that they might have hot particles or dust from an event like the Fukushima disaster, that they can have their homes or workplaces sampled and tested?
Well, if you were in Japan and you were close to the site, it's highly recommended. In a lot of prefectures, they actually are going house to house. And while the quality of the testing isn't perfect, it seems fairly wise. Once you get to the US, you're talking about using some fairly expensive equipment to get it done. You could get it tested, but I'm not sure it would be meaningful. What's happening here is they're hot particles, but they're far enough and few enough in between that it's probably not going to be possible to go back and find out what your exposure was. I mean, they came here, this radiation. It was a little hard to predict exactly where it was. I don't think we've got the testing horsepower to figure out who those individuals were who might have gotten an exposure. I know some folks ask me, well, I look at the map and I see that we're directly to the east of Fukushima. Should I move to Chile? So that might be an overreaction. I wouldn't tell anybody to move off the West Coast. I think it's more a matter of something happened that we didn't want to happen. We know it's going to impact public health. There's not a whole lot you can do about it.